Dip, dip, dip. Up and running to, oh, not that one. I don't want that one. Boom. All right, click that one off. Click that one off.
Are you ready for this?
Oh, I'm having fun. Trust me. I've not had a brain aneurysm in 3 days. All right, and make sure I get this thing up, make it look clear. I want to get the screen before I even get to anything else. Boom, boom. You are perfect in the frame. You're ready to go. Hold on. Let's go. 5, 4, 3.
Any music?
Oh yeah, I gotta get your music up. I was sitting there doing another thing. I was trying to edit this damn thing down.
Take your time. Do what you need to do.
Oh, thank you. I already got it open. It's not
we'll end at the right time.
Okay. In other words, just take your time.
Take your time.
There we go.
Do it right.
Damn screen is killing me.
It's all right.
Okay.
Musa.
No, I just came off of doing an interview while they were on the show.
So you're still up after Leo's show?
I did a 5-hour interview last night. Y'all don't get it. I'm beat the hell up. All right. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go.
The whole world's addicted to the drama, only attracted to things that bring the trauma. Overseas, yeah, we trying to stop terrorism, but we still got terrorists here living in the USA, the big CIA, the Bloods and the Crips and the KKK. But if you only have love for your own race, then you only leave space to discriminate, and to discriminate only generates hate. And when you hate, then you're bound to get irate. Yeah, madness is what you demonstrate, and that's exactly how anger works and operates. Man, you gotta have love just to set it straight. Take control of your mind and meditate. Let your soul gravitate to the love, y'all.
People killing, people dying, children hurt and you hear them crying. When you practice what you preach and what you turn the other cheek. Father, 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 help us, send some guidance from above. These people got me questioning, where is the love? Where is the love?
It just ain't the same, always will change. New days are strange, is the world insane? If love and peace is so strong, why are the pieces of love that don't belong? Nations dropping bombs, chemical gases filling lungs of little ones with ongoing suffering as the youth are young. So ask yourself, is the loving really gone? So I can ask myself, really what is going wrong in this world that we living in? People keep on giving in, making wrong decisions, only visions of them living in. Not respecting each other. Deny thy brother. A war's going on, but the reason's undercover. The truth is kept secret, it's swept under the rug. If you never know truth, then you never know love. What's the love, y'all? Come on, I don't know. What's the truth, y'all? Come on, I don't know. What's the love, y'all?
People killing, people dying, children hurt and you hear them crying. When you practice what you preach and what you turn the other cheek. Father, 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 help us, send some guidance from above. These people got me questioning, where is the love? 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 Where is the love?
Feel the weight of the world on my shoulder. As I'm getting older, your people gets older. Most of us only care about money making. Selfishness got us following the wrong direction. Wrong information always shown by the media. Negative images is the main criteria. Infecting the young minds faster than bacteria. Kids wanna act like what they see in the cinema. Whatever happened to the values of humanity? Whatever happened to the fairness and equality? Instead of spreading love, we're spreading animosity. Lack of understanding leading us away from unity. That's the reason why sometimes I'm feeling under. That's the reason why sometimes I'm feeling down. It's no wonder why sometimes I'm feeling under. Gotta keep my faith alive till love is found. Ashes.
Where is the love? Where is the love? Where is the love? Father, 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 help us, sons and guidance from above. These people got me questioning, where is the love?
Sing with me, y'all.
One word, one word.
We only got
One word, one word.
that's all we got.
One word, one word. There's something's wrong with it. Something's wrong with it. Something's wrong with the good world. Yeah, we only got one word, one word. That's all we got. One word, one word.
Welcome, everybody, to Ramona Speaks, The Other Truth on the Global Enlightenment Radio Network. Today, we're going to discuss eugenics and scientific racism and why that may be a big major factor in why people are hesitant to take this COVID shot. Perhaps. But we need to understand a little bit about our history here in the United States. First of all, let's talk about scientific racism. And it's sometimes termed biological racism, which is the pseudoscience belief that empirical evidence exists to support or justify racism. In other words, racial discrimination, racial inferiority, or racial superiority. Historically, though, scientific racism received credence through the scientific community, but it is no longer, get this, no longer considered scientific because there is no science, proven science to back it. It's just been dividing humankind into biological distinct groups, and it's sometimes called racism, race realism, or race science by its proponents. And modern scientific consensus rejects this view as being irreconcilable with modern genetic research. Scientific racism, it employs anthropology, notably physical anthropology, anthropometry, craniometry, and other disciplines or pseudo-disciplines in proposing anthropological typologies supporting the classification of human populations into physical, discrete human races, some of which might be asserted to be superior or inferior to others, but it just hasn't been proven. And after, I guess, 400 plus years to the end of World War II, there's just been no proof. Since the second half of the 20th century, scientific racism has been criticized as obsolete and discredited, yet has persistently been used to support or validate racist worldviews based upon belief in the existence and significance of racial categories and a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. After the end of World War II, scientific racism in theory and action was formally denounced. You didn't know that, did you? Especially the UNESCO's early anti-racist statement, The Race Question, in 1950. All of this when people talk about pure races and things like that, forget it. No such thing. The biological fact of race and the myth of race should be distinguished for all practical social purposes. Race is not so much a biological phenomenon as a social myth. The myth of race has created an enormous amount of human and social damage. Literally, literally. Do I need to say that again? The myth of race has created an enormous um, amount of human and social damage. And in recent years, this has taken a heavy toll in human lives and caused untold suffering. Since that time, developments in human evolutionary genetics and physical anthropology have led to a new consensus among anthropologists that human race is a socio-political phenomenon rather than a biological one. Now, if you've been on Facebook today or yesterday, you might have seen a video about North Carolina and its practices of eugenics up until I think it was 1994. I need to explain to you what eugenics is and how it is active as we speak. Eugenics is the set of beliefs and practices which aims at improving the genetic quality of the human population, playing a significant role in the history and culture of the United States from the late 19th century into the mid 20th century. Now, while ostensibly about improving genetic quality, it has been argued that eugenics was more about preserving the position of the dominant groups in the population. Research has determined that people who found themselves targets of the eugenics movement were those who were seen as unfit for society: the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, and specific communities of color, and a disproportionate number of those who fell victim to eugenicist sterilization initiatives were women who were identified as African American, Hispanic, or Native American. And as a result, the United States eugenics movement is now generally associated with racist and nativist elements, as the movement was to some extent a reaction to demographic and population changes, as well as concerns over the economy and the social well-being rather than scientific genetics. Now think about that for a second, because this is what your scientists are doing in the background with the cloning and, trying to make superhuman body parts to replace sick limbs. They are trying to preserve a dominant group of the population. So, how did it begin here? Because it's been around since ancient Greek when they used to kill the deformed babies and other poorly defined human beings at the time. The American genetics movement was rooted in a biological determinist ideas of a man named Sir Francis Galton, which originated in the 1880s. And in 1883, He first used the word eugenics to describe scientifically the biological improvement of genes in human races and the concept of being well born. He believed that differences in a person's ability were acquired primarily through genetics and that eugenics could be implemented through selective breeding in order for the human race to improve in its overall quality, therefore allowing for humans to direct their own evolution. In the US, eugenics was largely supported after the discovery of Mendel's law led to a widespread interest in the idea of breeding for specific traits. Now, pause there for a moment. Does anything come to mind like being able to determine or motivate the sex of an unborn child, having children born with certain color eyes, certain color hair, height, weight, all of this is what scientists are working on. Because evidently God's creation isn't good enough for them. They want to be gods. I mean, think about that. You thinking about it? Good. Because somewhere in that statement, you probably, some of the listeners probably don't fit into that definition. Okay? Think about that. The American eugenics movement received extensive funding from various corporate foundations, including the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad Fortune. In 1906, J.H. Kellogg provided funding to help fund the Race Betterment of Foundation in Battle Creek, Michigan. The Eugenics Record Office was founded in Cold Spring Harbor, New York in 1911 by the renowned biologist Charles Davenport, using money from both the Harriman Railroad Fortune and the Carnegie Institution. As late as the 1920s, the Eugenics Record Office was one of the leading organizations in the American eugenics movement. In years to come, it collected a mass of family pedigrees and provided training for eugenics field workers who were sent to analyze individuals at various institutions such as mental hospitals, orphanages across the United States. You know what that means, given the history. They were going in there experimenting on these poor individuals. Eugenists such as Davenport, the psychologist Henry Goddard, Harry H. Laughlin, and the conservationist Madison Grant, all of whom were well respected during their time, began to lobby for various solutions to the problem of the unfit. Davenport favored immigration restriction and sterilization as primary methods. We just went through an immigration restriction, and There was reports that those that were in the INS detention camps, some of the women reported being sterilized against their will. That's in 2020. And this was what, back in 1920? Oh my gosh, they're still doing it? The Calic family favored segregation, and Grant favored all of the above and more, even entertaining the idea of extermination. Let that sink in. This is our country we're talking about. By 1910, there was a large and dynamic network of scientists, reformers, and professionals engaged in national eugenics projects and actively promoting eugenic legislation. The American Breeders Association, are we talking about dogs here? No, they're talking about people, human beings. The first eugenic body in the US expanded in 1906 to include a specific eugenics committee under the directions of Charles Davenport. The ABA was formed specifically to investigate and report on heredity in the human race and emphasize the value of superior blood and the menace to society of inferior blood, whatever that means, because we have yet to determine who's superior and who's inferior. Membership included Alexander Graham Bell, Stanford President David Starr Jordan, and Luther Burbank. The American Association for the Study and Prevention of Infant Mortality was one of the first organizations to begin investigating infant mortality rates in terms of eugenics. They promoted government intervention. Let me say that again. They promoted government intervention in attempts to promote the health of future citizens. We're still talking about the US now, people, the United States of America. Several feminist reformers advocated an agenda of eugenic legal reform. The National Federation of Women's Clubs, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the National League of Women Voters, all white, were among the variety of state and local feminist organizations that at some point lobbied for eugenic reforms. One of the most prominent feminists to champion the eugenic agenda was Margaret Sanger, the leader of the American birth control movement and the founder of Planned Parenthood. Sanger saw birth control as a means to prevent unwanted children from being born into a disadvantaged life and incorporated the language of eugenics to advance the movement. Sanger also sought to discourage the reproduction of persons who, it was believed, would pass on mental disease or serious physical defects. In these cases, she approved of the use of sterilization. In Sanger's opinion, it was individual women, if able-bodied, and not the state who should determine whether or not to have a child. In the Deep South, women's associations played an important role in rallying support for eugenic legal reform. Eugenicists recognize the political and social influence of Southern club women in their communities and use them to help implement eugenics across the region. Between 1950 and 1920, federated women's clubs in every state of the Deep South had a critical role in establishing public eugenic institutions that were segregated by sex. For example, the Legislative Committee of the Florida State Federation of Women's Club successfully lobbied to institute a eugenic institution for the mentally retarded that was segregated by sex. And I say mentally retarded, now it's mentally disadvantaged or mentally challenged. Their aim was to separate mentally challenged men and women in order to prevent them from breeding more feeble-minded individuals. Playing God complex. And then you need to ask yourself, who are these people that they should decide on who's worthy to live and who's not? That's a mindset, people. That's a mindset that was running rampant in this country, in the United States of America. Public acceptance in the US led to various state legislators working to establish eugenic initiatives, beginning with Connecticut in 1896. Many states enacted marriage laws with eugenic criteria prohibiting anyone who was epileptic, imbecile, or feeble-minded from marrying. This is your history, people. The first state to introduce a compulsory sterilization bill was Michigan in 1897, although the proposed law failed to garner enough votes by legislators to be adopted. It did set the stage for other sterilization bills. Here's the government deciding on who to sterilize. 8 years later, Pennsylvania state legislators passed a sterilization bill that was vetoed by the governor. Indiana became the first state to enact sterilization legislation in 1907, followed closely by Washington, California, and Connecticut in 1909. Just think about that. I want to give you some time to think about all of this. This is in the United States. This is our government deciding who should live, who should die, who's not fit to have children. This is our government. This is in our country. What does that say? And we're still pushing the government interfering with reproductive organs. That's on some people's agenda. They want to take that right away from the individual and put it in the hands of the government so they can. I'm sorry. I just find this so abhorrent. Who to marry? Who's capable of marriage? Who should be having babies and who shouldn't? Who's more worthy than the next person? And as we all know, just about every family has a birth defect somewhere along that line. 8 years later, after Pennsylvania state legislature passed the sterilization bill that was vetoed by the government, all these other states, 4 or 5 other states joined in. Sterilization rates across the country were relatively low at that time. California being the sole exception until the 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, which legitimized the forced sterilizations of patients at a Virginia home for those who were seen as mentally challenged. Then come the immigration restrictions. In the late 19th century, many scientists who were concerned about the population leaning too far away, the scientists who were concerned about the population leaning too far away from the favored Anglo-Saxon superiority due to a rise in immigration from Europe, partnered with other interest groups to implement immigration laws that could be justified on the basis of genetics. After the 1890 US Census, people began to believe that immigrants who were of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon stock were greatly favored over Southern and Eastern Europeans, especially Jews, a diasporic Middle Eastern people who were seen by some eugenicists like Harry Laughlin to be genetically inferior. During the early 20th century, as the United States and Canada began to receive higher numbers of immigrants, influential eugenicists like Lothrop, Stoddard, and Laughlin, who was appointed as an expert witness for the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization in 1920, presented arguments that these immigrants would pollute the national gene pool if their numbers went unrestricted. Now, you would think that if they were going to enact immigration laws, it would be because it had something to do with economics or disease. But no, they were feeling that it was a threat to the Nordic or Anglo-Saxon stock. This is still our country, people. These are your leaders, your scientists, the people that are governing you, deciding about your life. What do you have to say to that, Daryl, so far? Any comments?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was a little bit loud. I was blasting it into the other room. So let me, you know what's really funny about you talking about 1908, 1909,
1920.
all the way up to 1920. Do you know what your president was at the time?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say it.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, say it. Tell the
Democrats.
people.
Democrats. Every one of them were Democratic presidents.
Yeah.
During that time era.
The Southern Democrats.
And
and there was another group in there too.
The progressive movement.
Yeah, the Whigs.
The bull moose, as they used to call it.
Yeah.
Bull moose, progressives. Yeah. Also, you had it sounds familiar, doesn't it?
But
they threw you this bloody beautiful shot today, didn't they?
But it we're only at 1921. They weren't all Democrats.
Well, for the beginning statement,
we're going from 1897, 1913, and 1950, 1917, and we're still moving forward. What was President Wilson?
He was a Democrat.
President Wilson's second veto was overruled by Congress. He vetoed it. It was
I guess enough money didn't fall. I guess plenty of money didn't hit that pocket. The bottom line is, and now you're looking at today's world, since you're going straight through the centuries, you might as well hit the Tuskegee Airmen.
Oh,
They were beta tested for.
I'm gonna be.
You want to hit all that? Oh, I'm gonna slow down because you know I'm going to do it. Because you know today, because today me and Dr. Paul and you know we were talking, and yes, Dr. Paul is now part of the network. Yes, Dr. Paul Cottrell, thank you very much. Welcome to the network, brother. We were talking about the same topic after the show with him and Leo Zagami, and he goes, did you notice that all of it started? And here's the funny thing, they were also in favor of Nazi Germany. No one wants to talk about that either.
Well, I just said
And
that they
what
felt that
Germans
the Jewish people that were immigrants were inferior. This is our country.
Does it sound familiar? But does it sound familiar? I mean, people don't look at their history.
You're not going to like that answer.
It's the same answer that you're going to hear all the way through. And the only reason why today they are so concerned, well, you know, let's be honest, there's nobody going to nuke Israel. I'm going to be honest with you. Nobody's going to nuke nobody because the whole Middle East is surrounding it. So people need to, you know, get that game out their head. But on the other side, what you're saying is 100% true. I'm not going to say I'm sitting back. I'm relaxing because it sounds familiar with this new shot we got. Well, the people out there are getting that has been recalled and then re-recalled, and they're waiting on the fourth wave to come through, which they say is going to be worse. But hey, you know, you got hope.
Yeah, but I'm gonna. I hope I'm gonna show a trend because we've only had 19 Democrats as president in the United States. So let's not politicize it to one side or another because that's not going to fly. That's not actual. They all, in some way, shape, or form. And then it's not necessarily even the president, but don't forget there's the Senate and Congress who's making this up. Okay, so now, eugenics believed that immigrants were often degenerate, had low IQs, and were afflicted with shiftlessness, alcoholism, and insubordination. Only the immigrants, nobody else. All of these problems, according to them, were transmitted through genes. Literacy test bills were vetoed by presidents in 1897, 1913, and 1915. And eventually, President Wilson's second veto was overruled by Congress in 1970. Now, with the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924, eugenics for the first time in 1924 played an important role in the congressional debate as expert advisors on the threat of inferior stock from Eastern and Southern Europe. They're not talking about Black people at this point. They're mute thing. The Native Americans, the Africans that were brought over. They're not talking about, they're talking about the Eastern and Southern Europeans coming over were inferior stock to the Anglo-Saxon Nordic. The new act, inspired by the eugenic belief in the racial superiority of old stock white Americans as members of the Nordic race, a form of white supremacy, strengthened the position of existing laws prohibiting race mixing. Whereas Anglo-Saxon and Nordic people were seen as the most desirable immigrants, and the Chinese and Japanese were seen as the least desirable and were largely banned from entering the US as a result of this Immigration Act. In addition to the Immigration Act, eugenic considerations also lay behind the adoption of incest laws in much of the US and were used to justify many anti-miscegenation laws. Think about that, people. This is your country. These are the people that's ruling it, your government. That's a shame. Now, they move on to the efforts to shape American families, unfit versus fit individuals. Both class and race factored into the eugenic definitions of fit and unfit. By using intelligence testing, American eugenicists asserted that social mobility was indicative of one's genetic fitness. This reaffirmed the existing class and racial hierarchies and explained why the upper to middle class was predominantly white. Middle to upper class status was a marker of superior strains. In contrast, eugenists believe poverty to be a characteristic of genetic inferiority. You hear that? Poor people in the country? Which meant that those deemed unfit were predominantly of the lower classes. They didn't care what color your skin was. Because class status designated some more fit than others, eugenists treated upper and lower class women differently. Oh, here we go. Positive eugenists who promoted procreation among the fittest in society. And what did they determine was the fittest? Nordic and Anglo-Saxon. The IQ of those that were being educated at the time, working. Those were the ones that they felt were encouraged to bear more children. Between 1900 and 1960, eugenists appealed to middle-class white women to become more family-minded, not out of religion, not out of working the farms or anything, but to keep this race of people going. And to help better the race. To this end, eugenists often denied middle and upper class women sterilization and birth control. Didn't matter if they almost died in childbirth. That didn't matter. They wanted that particular breed of woman to have their babies and populate this country. This is our government. This is the molding of our country. However, since poverty was associated with prostitution and mental idiocy, women of the lower classes were the first to be deemed unfit and promiscuous. Then there's the concern over hereditary genes. In the 19th century, based on a view of Marxism, it was believed that the damage done to people by diseases could be inherited, and therefore through eugenics, these diseases could be eradicated. This belief was carried into the 20th century as public health measures were taken to improve health with the hope that such measures would result in better health of future generations. But we got to remember who the future generations that they have in mind. At Carnegie Institute, report explored 18 methods for removing defective genetic attributes. The 8th method was euthanasia. Though the most commonly suggested method of euthanasia was set up as logical or local gas chambers. Many in the eugenics movement did not believe that Americans were ready to implement a large-scale euthanasia program. Listen to this. Do you hear what I'm saying? They were debating in this country of setting up local gas chambers. But since they didn't feel that Americans were quite ready for that on a large scale, it was all right over in Germany. Oh my God. So the doctors came up with alternative ways of subtly implementing eugenic euthanasia in various medical institutions. See, all of this, people, is about the suspicious, not trusting our medical and government organization. And you wonder why. For example, a mental institution in Lincoln, Illinois fed its incoming patients milk infected with tuberculosis, reasoning that genetically fit individuals would be resistant. And this resulted in 30 to 40% annual death rates. Other doctors practice euthanasia through various forms of lethal neglect. You know, sort of like how, you know, without medical, they don't want everybody to have medical insurance. So if you're too poor to afford medical insurance, well, then you don't get the type of medical care that you need, and you subsequently die. Because quiet as it's kept, there's a large alarming number of women that are still dying in childbirth today. This is your United States of America, and this is your government, people. In the 1930s, there was a wave of portrayals of eugenic mercy killings in American film, newspapers, and magazines. Okay, here comes the brainwashing. In 1931, the Illinois Homeopathic Medicine Association began lobbying for the right to euthanize imbeciles and other defectives. People born without limbs, born blind, born deaf. I mean, there's a million defects that the human body is prone to. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. But however, despite this, euthanasia saw marginal support in the US, motivating people to turn to forced segregation and sterilization programs as a means for keeping the unfit from producing. And they talk about, wow. And then here we come to the Better Baby Contest. A woman by the name of Mary DeDermore, a former teacher, was the first person to combine ideas about health and intelligence standards with competitions at state fairs in the form of baby contests. She developed the first such contest, the Scientific Baby Contest, for the Louisiana State Fair in Shreveport in 1908. She saw these contests as a contribution to the social efficiency movement, which was advocating for the standardization of all aspects of American life as a means of increasing efficiency. Dr. DeGarmo was assisted by Dr. Jacob Bodenheimer, a pediatrician who helped her develop grading sheets for contestants which combined physical measurements with standardized measurements of intelligence. The contest spread to other U.S. states. In Indiana, for example, Ada Schweitzer, a eugenics advocate and director of the Indiana State Board of Health's Division of Child and Infant Hygiene, organized and supervised the state's Better Baby contest at the Indiana State Fair from 1920 to 1932. It was among the fair's most popular events. During the contest's first year at the fair, a total of 78 babies were examined. In 1925, the total reached 885. Contestants peaked at 1,300 infants in 1930, and the following year, the number of entrants was capped at 1,200. Although the specific impact of the contests were difficult to assess, statistics helped to support Schweitzer's claims that the contest helped reduce infant mortality. How? The intent of the contest was to educate the public about raising healthier children as during the time period. It was approximated that 100 infants out of every 1,000 births passed away prior to their first birthday. However, its exclusionary practices reinforced social, class, and racial discrimination. In Indiana, for example, the contestants were limited to white infants. African American and immigrant children were barred from the competition for ribbons and cash prizes. In addition, the scoring was biased towards white middle-class babies. The contest procedure included recording each child's health history, as well as evaluations of each contestant's physical and mental health and overall development using medical professions. Using a process similar to the one introduced at the Louisiana State Fair, contest guidelines that the AMA, American Medical Association, and U.S. Child's Bureau recommended scoring for each contestant began with 1,000 points and then started deducting deductions were made for the defects, including the child's measurements below a designated average, et cetera, and the contest. The contestant with the most points was declared the winner. Okay, now think about that. They're doing measurements, their health, whatever. And not everybody during those days were employed. Not everybody had access to medical attention. There were a lot of poor people during that time. So food was not that readily accessible. But they took this to mean that if you were in those classes that couldn't afford these things, there was something wrong with you. Now, the NAACP promoted eugenics by hosting Better Baby contests, and the proceeds would go to its anti-lynching campaign. Then they came with the Fitter Families, first appearing in 1920 at the Kansas Fitter Families for Future Firesides competitions. And it continued all the way up to World War II. They took the idea of positive eugenics for babies and combined it with the determinist concept of biology to come up with Fitter Family competitions. And it goes on and on, all these different ways that secretly they were probably, and this is just my opinion, but knowing how they operate, they were probably taking names and addresses of people who they felt were unfit, and they would deal with them later. I mean, this is just crazy. This is crazy, but this is our country, and this was our government, and these were our doctors, people that are supposed to help us, not hurt us and eliminate us. See, because in the back of their minds, they're already thinking about gas chambers for the United States. This is just, but this is where all this brainwashing began. It was never a equal rating system. And it's not like, you know, the fittest, meaning everybody has a chance and the fittest is the winner, because it was unequal. And they admit that, because the poor was largely underserved. They didn't really care back then, as some of these people don't now. As if somebody said to themselves, okay, I'm getting ready to be born. I want to be born in a poor family. I want to struggle my life. I don't want the advantages that some people who but nothing that they've done ends up in a wealthy family. So we have class and we have race against fellow Americans. And the governments are backing all of this bull. So the number of sterilizations performed per year increased until another Supreme Court case, Skinner versus Oklahoma in 1942, which ruled that under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, laws that permitted compulsory sterilization of criminals were unconstitutional, and if these laws treated similar crimes differently. Although Skinner determined that the right to procreate was a fundamental right under the Constitution, well, how could it not be? I mean, you didn't need a constitution to know. I mean, think what that is saying. The right to procreate was a fundamental right under the Constitution. So they had to make a law to make it okay for you to procreate. Why? Think about that. There are so many crevices and corners and holes that is surrounding this country and its treatment of its citizens, that you need to open your eyes and not let these things happen again. Although Skinner determined that the right to procreate was a fundamental right under the Constitution, the case did not denounce sterilization laws, as the analyst was based on the equal protection of criminal defendants specifically. Therefore, leaving those seen as social undesirables, the poor, the disabled, and various ethnic groups, as targets of compulsory sterilization. This is our country. This went on. Therefore, compulsory sterilization is now considered an abuse of human rights. Buck versus Bell has never been overturned, and Virginia specifically did not repeal its sterilization law until 1974, which means that they were doing it legally without the consent of the people involved up through 1974. Who knows what they're doing now, or any of these governments are doing, state governments are doing. Men and women were compulsorily sterilized for different reasons. Men were sterilized to treat their aggression and to eliminate their criminal behavior. Oh, wow. So does that mean that all men were sterilized? You know, because the male is supposed to be the aggressor. And if that's all it takes to sterilize somebody, then there wouldn't be any more pedophiles, right? While women were sterilized to control the results of their sexuality. Oh, heaven forbid that women want to enjoy sex or not be a sex slave to a husband or whatever concerning her body. So since women bore children, eugenics held women more accountable than men for the reproduction of the less desirable members of society. Oh, okay, so now we're going to put it on the women. Not the genes in the man. I mean, these are the intelligent communities of those times and the way they thought. So eugenicists therefore predominantly targeted women in their efforts to regulate the birth weight, not to tell the men to keep their penises in their pocket, their pants. That's okay. But they're going to target the women to regulate the birth rate, to protect white racial health and weed out the defectives of society. Now, the most significant area of eugenic sterilization was between 1907 and 1963, when over 64,000 individuals were forcibly sterilized under this legislation in the United States. Beginning around 1930, there was a steady increase in the percentage of women sterilized. And in a few states, only young women were sterilized, never having a chance to give birth. A 1937 Fortune magazine poll found that 2/3 of respondents supported eugenic sterilization of mental defectives. 63% supported sterilization of criminals, and only 15% opposed both. And from 1930 to the 60s, sterilizations were performed on many more institutionalized women than men. By 1961, 61% of the 62,162 total eugenic sterilizations in the United States were performed on women. A favorable report on the result of sterilization in California, the state that conducted the most sterilizations, 20,000 of the 60,000, was published in a book formed by the biologist Paul Popenoe and was widely cited by the Nazi government as evidence that wide-reaching sterilization programs were feasible and humane. So they got that from us, or I should say, the US. Eugenics sterilization in the African American community. Black support for eugenics. Early proponents of the eugenics movement included not only influential white Americans, but also several proponent African American intellectuals, those that thought they were above everybody else and knew more than the average person. E.B. Du Bois, Thomas Wyatt Turner, and many academics at Tuskegee University, Howard University, and Hampton University. However, unlike many white eugenists, these Black intellectuals believed the best African Americans were as good as the best white Americans, and the talented 10th of all races should mix. Indeed, Du Bois believed only fit Blacks should procreate to eradicate the racist heritage of moral iniquity. Even he bought into it. But then that's the sign of the times. Ah, Jesus. So with support like Du Bois, because, you know, these white folks rely on Black people who will back up some of the awful things that they say and do. Efforts were made to control the reproduction of the country's Black population. It's always a turncoat. One of the most visible initiatives was the 1939 proposal by Margaret Sanger, the Negro Project. That year, Sanger, Florence Rose, her assistant, and Mary Woodward Reinhardt, then a secretary of the New Birth Control Federation of America, drafted a report on birth control and the Negro. In this report, they stated that African Americans were the group with the greatest economic, health, and social problems, were largely illiterate, and still breed carelessly and disastrously. And that was a line taken from W.E.B. Du Bois' article in the June 1932 Birth Control Review. All they want is just one to back them. And you can always find one. The project often sought after prominent African American leaders, sounds familiar, to spread knowledge regarding birth control and the perceived positive effects it would have on the African American community, such as poverty and the lack of education. See, that is what they were telling them. And nobody has a problem with that as long as they keep from having babies and multiplying. Because that's what they were doing it for. It had nothing to do with poverty. It had nothing to do with the lack of education. It had everything to do with limiting their population. And so Sanger particularly sought out Black ministers from the South to serve as leaders in the project in the hopes of Black population. However, despite her best efforts, white medical scientists took control over the initiative, and with the Negro Project receiving praise from white leaders and eugenists, many of Sanger's opponents, both during the creation of the project and years after, saw her work as an attempt to terminate African Americans. Saw right through it. Now, let's move to the civil rights era. Opposition to initiatives to control reproduction with the African American community grew in the 1960s, particularly after President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 announced the establishment of federal funding of birth control used on the poor. In the 1960s, many African Americans throughout the country took the government's decision to fund birth control clinics as an attempt to limit the growth of the Black population, and along with it, the increased political power that Black Americans were fighting to acquire. Scholars have stated that African Americans' fear about their reproductive health and ability was rooted in history as under US slavery. Enslaved women were often coerced or forced to have children or breed to increase a plantation owner's wealth. Therefore, many African Americans, particularly those in the Black Power movement, saw birth control and federal support of the pill as equivalent to Black genocide, declaring it as such at the 1967 Black Power Conference. Federal funding for birth control went alongside family planning initiatives that were a part of state welfare programs. These initiatives, in addition to advocating the use of the pill, supported sterilization as a means of curbing the number of people receiving welfare and control the reproduction of unfit women. The 1950s and 60s were the height of the sterilization abuse that African American women as a group experienced at the hands of the white medical establishment. During this period, the sterilization of African American women largely took place in the South and assumed two forms: the sterilization of poor unwed Black mothers and Mississippi appendectomies. Under these Mississippi appendectomies, women who went to the hospital to give birth or for some other medical treatment often found themselves incapable of having more children upon leaving the hospital due to unnecessary hysterectomies performed on them by Southern medical students. By the 1970s, the coerced sterilization of women of color spread from the South to the rest of the country through federal family planning and under the guise of voluntary contraceptive surgery, as physicians began to require their patients to sign consent forms to surgeries they did not want nor understand. Though it is unknown the exact number of African American women who were sterilized throughout the country in the 20th centuries, records from a few states offer some estimates. In the state of North Carolina, which was seen as having the most aggressive eugenics programs out of the 32 states that had one, during the 45-year reign of the North Carolina Eugenics Board from 1929 to 1974, a disappropriate number of those who were targeted for forced or coerced sterilization were Black and female, with almost all being poor. Of the 7,600 women of which we know about who were sterilized by the state between the years of 1933 and 1973, about 5,000 were African American. In light of this history, North Carolina became the first state to offer compensation to surviving victims of compulsory sterilization. Additionally, whereas African Americans made up just over 1% of California's population, they accounted for at least 4% of the total number of sterilization operations conducted by the state between 1909 and 1979. Overall, according to one 1989 study, 31.6% of African American women without a high school diploma were sterilized, while only 14.5% of white women of the same educational status were sterilized. They were big on sterilizing uneducated women. And probably the reason why it was so less on the poor white women were because they were allowed to have babies so their babies could be adopted out to those women who could not have children. Sterilization abuse brought to the media attention. Finally, in 1972, the United States Senate Committee testimony brought to light that at least 2,000 involuntary sterilizations had been performed on poor Black women without their constant consent or knowledge. An investigation revealed that the surgeries were all performed in the South and were all performed on Black women with multiple children who were receiving welfare. Testimony revealed that many of these women were threatened with an end to their welfare benefits unless they consented to sterilization. These surgeries were instances of sterilization abuse, a term applied to any sterilization performed without the consent or knowledge of the recipient, or in which the recipient is pressured into accepting the surgery. Because the funds used to carry out the surgeries came from the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity, the sterilization abuse raised suspicion, especially among members of the Black community, that federal programs were underwriting eugenicists who wanted to impose their views about population quality on minorities and poor women. Despite the investigation, this is just horrible. Despite this investigation, it was not until 1973 that the issues of sterilization abuse was brought to media attention. On June 14, 1973, two Black girls, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph, ages 14 and 12, respectively, were sterilized without their knowledge in Alabama by the Montgomery Community Action Committee, an OEO financed organization. The summer of that year, the Reef Girls sued government agencies and individuals responsible for their sterilization. As the case was being pursued, it was discovered that the girl's mother, who could not read, unwittingly approved the operation, signing an X on the release forms. Mrs. Reff had believed that she was signing a form authorizing her daughters to receive Depo-Provera injections, a form of birth control. In light of the 1974 case of Reff versus Weinberger, named after Minnie Lee and Mary Alice's older sister, Katie, who had narrowly escaped also being sterilized, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare were ordered to establish new guidelines for its government sterilization policy. So by 1979, the new guidelines finally addressed the concern over informed consent. determined that minors under the age of 21 and those with severe mentally impairments who could not give consent would not be sterilized, and articulated the provision that doctors could no longer claim that a woman's refusal to be sterilized would result in her being denied welfare benefits. Then there was the sterilization of Latina women. The 20th century demarcated at a time which compulsory sterilization heavily navigated its way into primarily Latina communities against Latina women. Locations such as Puerto Rico and Los Angeles, California, were found to have had large amounts of their female population coerced into sterilization procedures without quality and necessary informed consent nor full awareness of the procedure. That's our country, people. That's our country, that's our medical and our government, all in cahoots. In Puerto Rico, nearly 1/3 of the female population in Puerto Rico was sterilized between 1930 to 1970. At the time, this was the highest rate of sterilization in the world. One-third of the female population in Puerto Rico was sterilized. That's that you know about. Some viewed sterilization as a means of rectifying the country's poverty and unemployment rates. Following legalization of the procedure in 1937, a U.S. government endorsed initiative saw health department procedure officials advocating for sterilization in rural parts of the island. Sterilized women were also encouraged to join the workforce, in particular the textile and clothing related industries. While the white women counterparts, see, they wanted them to stay home. They were fighting to get out into the workforce.
Ramona, what year was this?
And that was between the 1930s and 1970s.
They were sterilizing Puerto Rico women?
1/3 of the female population in Puerto Rico was sterilized.
Good God.
1/3 of the female population in Puerto Rico. They wanted them out on the workforce. They couldn't stay home like white women and be housewives.
Okay, so the statement and the derogatory statement they used to say about Puerto Ricans, they spread like rats. Didn't mean anything to. Ain't that America? You and me.
And the government.
And the government. Something to see, baby.
I mean, you know, I thought this is important so people can understand why there's hesitancy around this COVID. This is your history, people. This is the factual information documented of what this country has done to the poor, the disabled, the minorities, all that they felt were fit to breathe air on this planet. This is truth. There won't be any banning this or fact checking. They can fact check. They know this is truth. This is what happened. We are up to the 70s now. That's just 30 years ago.
This is a shame. It's a shame. You people out there are the ones that are letting this thing happen. Your mothers, your father, your grandmothers are part of the situation that let this
It's so
eugenics
hard for me to
ideology
keep
happen.
from crying because this is so sad. Only in America.
America. Yeah. And guess what? Those are American citizens. They did it too. Never mind. I'm gonna let it go. Go ahead, Ramon. I can't. I gotta. I gotta.
Yeah, what does Nida have to say? Is she listening? Because that's her home. 1/3 of the women in Puerto Rico between what 1930 and 40 years, they sterilized 1/3 of the women in Puerto Rico. Now, we haven't even gotten to the Native American women. Native American women and activists mobilized in the 1970s across the United States to combat the coerced sterilization. The 1970s, 30 years ago, right? 30 years ago? Just 30 years ago. They mobilized to combat the coerced sterilization of Native American women and advocate for their reproductive rights alongside tribal sovereignty in the Red Power movement. Some of the most prominent activist organizations established in this decade and an active in the Red Power movement and the resistance against coerced sterilization were the American Indian Movement, AIM, United Native Americans, Women of All Red Nations, WARN, WARN, the International Indian Treaty Council, IITC, and India Women United for Justice, founded by Dr. Constance Redbird Pinkerton Urey, a Cherokee Choctaw physician. Some Native American activists have deemed the coerced sterilization of Native American women a modern form of genocide and view these sterilizations as a violation of the rights of tribes as sovereign nations. Others argue that the sterilization of Native American women is interconnected with the colonialist and capitalist motives of corporations and the federal government to acquire land and natural resources, including oil, natural gas, and coal, currently located on Native American reservations. You know, that place where they took the natives out of their flourishing green lands and stuck them out somewhere where they thought nothing would grow and that they would die off from starvation. Those reservations that they know now as oil and natural resources like gas and coal on them.
You mean Camp Kick-a-Rock? They sent them to Camp Kick-a-Rock. That's where they sent them. Where it was nothing but rocks. Rocks. That's why it was
all
a trail
over.
of tears.
Most every reservation was like that.
Yep. No grass, no
They
trees,
didn't have any
no beautiful,
intention
no
of
nature,
them
and you don't have a
surviving.
lake.
They didn't have any intention of them surviving. They thought they'd go out there and starve to death. They don't even have water, sufficient water in some of those places. It's
No lake,
all a form
no
of
water.
genocide. It's systemic.
I can't do it. Y'all hurting me here.
It's systemic. And people need to understand. And not only that, not only the sterilizations, but the forced removal of the children to adopt them out to white families that had none. This is your country, people. Let's talk about the influence of Nazi Germany. Because they took that eugenics and ran with it, didn't they? After the eugenics movement was well established in the United States, after it was established here, that genocide, that killing of people here, it spread to Germany. California eugenics began producing literature promoting eugenics and sterilization and sending it overseas to German scientists and medical professionals. By 1933, California had subjected more people to forceful sterilizations than all over US states combined. The forced sterilization program engineered by the Nazis was partly inspired by Californians. Remember, I said earlier, they were thinking of euthanasia to put up gas things here, but they didn't. Oh, the Americans, they're not ready for this. There's too many of those Christians here. They're not going to go for that. We got to think of some other kind of way. The Rockefeller Foundation helped develop and fund various German eugenics programs, including the one that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. Upon returning from Germany in 1934, more than 5,000 people per month. 5,000 people per month. See, we've heard about that in Nazi Germany. All this other stuff you didn't hear about here. They were sterilizing people, 5,000 of them every month, and under the crudest of circumstances, to see how much pain they could. Oh God, I don't even want to go there. Goethe, we remember Goethe from that time. He bragged to a colleague, "You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler and this epoch-making program. Everywhere I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people." This is what one of the worst monsters in Nazi Germany said to his friend, stimulated by American thought. You hear that, people? Do you hear that? Is that sinking in? And we all know what that American thought resulted in Nazi Germany. And if you're not careful, it will happen here, because they already tried it and they've been working on it for a very long time. Now, remember back, I told you about Laughlin, the eugenics researcher. He often bragged that his model eugenics sterilization laws had been implemented in the 1935 Nuremberg racial hygiene laws. Proud American. Laughlin was invited to an award ceremony at Heidelberg University in Germany, scheduled on the anniversary of Hitler's 1934 purge of Jews from the Heidelberg facility to receive an honorary doctorate for his work on the science of racial cleansing, this proud American. But due to financial limitations, he was unable to attend the ceremony and had to pick it up from the Rockefeller Institute. Afterwards, though, he proudly shared the award with his colleagues, remarking that he felt that it symbolized the common understanding of German and American scientists of the nature of eugenics. Henry Friedlander wrote that although the German and American eugenics movements were similar, the US did not follow the same slippery slope as Nazi eugenics because American federalism and political heterogeneity encouraged diversity even with a single movement. In contrast, the German eugenics movement was more centralized and had fewer diverse ideas.
What the hell is that supposed to mean?
That means that they
did the same damn thing
on the Jews.
They did the same damn thing. So it was specialized for the Jews. They learned it for the Jews. They did it to the Jews, and the Americans, they did it to everybody that was low, small, or nobodied.
But they stopped short of the gas chamber. Remember, that was one of their first ideas to implement in 1931. They had that plan in motion. I wonder who picked that plan up.
Germany did, right? Hold on. But we did have the gas chamber back in the old days when they gassed the people that were convicted killers.
Oh yeah.
That was fulfilled, but they had to bring it to a penal system. Right. Think about that word.
Because they couldn't let it go to waste. They had spent so much time on it.
And so much money was used to create it.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then we went even further. Same thing the Germans did. Lethal injection.
Yeah.
You might as well stick them inside some radiation full room and just tell them to walk in and walk out so they can just go ahead and die or something. You know what I mean? These people are sick.
That's your country.
But hold on. Yeah. That's your country, people. And look at you now. More test dummies, like the man told me the other day. Yeah, I was a test dummy. I took that Johnson & Johnson shot.
Well, I mean, you stop and think about it. They had the vaccinations for the measles and chickenpox and stuff like that. And those were all but gone until people that had not had those came in with it. And it started back up again.
Supposedly. But I mean,
because I knew some people who caught the measles, but
yeah, that's heard. Yeah, that's that. But what they used to do back in the day when you had the measles, the little boy had a measles. Hey, we gonna have a measles party, But the idea is not.
I almost went blind.
Shingles came from that too. But here's the next thing. I mean, when we're looking at all this illness, you got to say, how did it get here? How did it get created? Think about it. I mean, you got to think it. This topic is going to take me to another level. I don't want to go there, Ramona. Please, just.
I tried to condense it down within these 2 hours.
I'm hurt, Ramona. I mean,
you got to know where you come from in order to move forward. You got to see the signs. And my intention here, because I was upset at first. But then, I started thinking, why are so many white people so against this? Nothing was ever done to them, by taking this vaccine. Why? Because they know what has been done to other people. This is their history. And now I think at this point, they realize that they are just as expendable as anybody else now.
Like the way you said that, expendable. I mean, you're at this people around the world are to the elite. Well, we won't say the elite because all this is a game. To the many are part of a plan, and we don't know what their plan's outcome or ending is, but
Don't.
we never will.
But
We're not part of that game.
But I think one thing, you know, because I've mulled it over this last entire year and up until this year to figure out what is the end game. What would be the point of, at this point, knowing what we know? And if somebody wanted to kill us off, they have so many ways to do it because they've done it. And injections and through the medical, the way they've done, that cover's been blown. And what would be the purpose? Because there's too many people that have taken the COVID. And so, having said that, they've taken the COVID shot, all walks of life, every, you know, whatever, unless the bottles are color coded.
Willing guinea pigs, remember that word, willing guinea pigs.
Yeah. Well, that's part of medical. You need, and they did have the guinea pigs.
And they got, and they didn't wait long enough to find out if the test results of the guinea pigs was successful.
You know why? Because too many of the population was screaming their rights were being violated. Not their right to live, but their rights to die. If you never gave this a chance, who knows? Had you sucked it up, stayed home for 3 months, not everybody had to. Because I know people who have been working continuously in CEO jobs. But had you given it a freaking chance, we will never know now.
Well, hold on, Ramona. Florida has reported that places where the people are living their lives and out in public without the mask, no COVID. But now you got places with masks with a lot of COVID.
Florida. My thing is that the most congested areas are the ones where the highest counts are because there's people piled up on people. Constant. Whereas where I am, I think it's only like, the last I heard it was 11 cases. And we didn't shut down, but we did mask and social distance. So, you know, I mean, if you walked outside my house or, you know, drove in my little town, you wouldn't think anything was going on, except people were having masks and hoarding for the first 6 months. But in Houston, there's like 4 million people there. New York, you know, these are places where people are piled upon pile of each other. Overpopulation is not the problem as much as populations in centers. It's like rats or like this colony of cats that I have. You know, when you have a lot and one gets sick, you know, most of them will be sick. You pile rats. They did a study before they started even building those high rises where in the concrete jungle. I remember studying that back in the 70s. They did that to try to, after they did laboratory tests with rats, and they put the rats in a cage, stacked up cage with a lot of them, and they couldn't have any place to go. They were constantly around each other, and they tried to kill each other. And they said, yes, we're going to build those, and we're going to build them in certain parts. It's where it's overly populated. When it takes you 30 minutes and you still in the same city on the same freeway, there's too many people in that one area. So anyway, my time is almost up. I want to round it off by saying I understand why people are not rushing. I did take the COVID shot. I don't regret that I did. My octogenarian parents did. They've been fine, no side effects. I don't have any side effects yet. And I'm thinking, I just tell myself, okay, maybe they know something even worse is coming. Maybe the ones who get the shot are the ones that's going to survive whatever that is they're expecting. Maybe it's doing something because evidently the study of genetics is not new. It didn't just evolve in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s. They were doing that in what, 1800 and something? Lets you know that they're far more advanced than we think they are, which goes to maybe add a lot more validity to these higher beings with the information, because they were still pooping in the alleyways in the 1800s and outhouses, but they were working on genetics. There's a lot going on in this world, people. There is a lot. Do not get caught sleeping. Do not get caught focusing on what they want you to focus on. Because who knows? The perfect setup to me would be to get half of the population to say they won't take it, they won't do it. And those are the ones that we will get rid of. They'll die. Maybe, I'm just saying, that would be, if I were a mad scientist, I would use that kind of psychological and input so that those that do, and those that don't, won't. But who will be left standing? And we won't know that until the future. But we do know this, that people are dying, and that thing is not going away, whatever it is. And since we know what people are capable of, who knows if it's not genetically engineered? And if it's genetically engineered, they know what can stop it and what can't. Either way, people are worried about genocide or getting rid of people. But the thing is are you working for them or against them? You won't know. That's a question that you need to ask yourself. And you need to delve into the history and open your eyes. So, any last thoughts, Daryl?
Last thought. Okay, I give you a last thought. You ready?
Uh-huh.
I wouldn't take the shot if you paid me. Last thought number 2, drink lots of beer, wine, and liquor, and smoke weed, everybody. And if you got a pack of cigarettes, go ahead and smoke those too, because it's the end of the world as you know it. These kids are going to drive your house through the floor because they crazy out there. They want to control you. They want to make sure they dominate you. And it's not just the government, it's your own in-house.
Yeah. Just don't let it happen, people. Stand up for yourself. Do what you feel in your heart, because your heart and your spirit, I believe your spirit lets you know what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's not. Don't go on what somebody's telling you, but really ask yourself, ask the Creator, what do I do? Me, I'm not afraid, because whatever happens, happens. You know, everybody, every 2 minutes or 6 minutes, somebody dies. So it's not that. It's just that we're caught up in this Game of Thrones of which we have no parts. I just ran down a history of the United States that most of the people in here had no parts in, but they were subjected to. And that's what I'm trying to get across to you, that you have to understand what these people are saying and doing to you. When I say these people, I mean those that are molding you to think a certain way. You've got to learn to go and seek for yourself, and don't listen to anybody else. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to Daryl. Don't listen to any of these people. Go look and research you got to go back. You trace the beginnings and come forward up into this point, and it starts to unfold itself. And with that, Daryl, take me home.
And you're home. That was a listen. That show, you impressed me. You listen. Somebody can get me under my skin. Oh, here comes Robert Ed. Somebody can get under my skin like that to piss me the fuck off to that point where I just couldn't. Man, you know exactly where I'm coming from. What's up, Ed? I was hot.
See, I try to go back because I can just go back to last year or 5 years ago. But we are here today, not because of what happened yesterday, but where it started. And see, I bet you a lot of people listening do not know that they were studying genetics in the late 17, early 1800s, when they had slaves and shitting in the street.
Yeah.
Wasn't even washing their butts, but they were studying genetics.
Yeah.
That leads to other things, other knowledge, other questions.
And it's like, how smart were they really, huh?
I don't know why I'm talking so loud. Should have told me to turn this
You were
down.
just hot, Ramona. I'm just gonna say you were angry. Your eyes opened up and I saw a new person come out. I was like, hot damn, this woman's gonna kill somebody in a few minutes. Watch out, everybody.
But people need to know.
Yeah.
They need to know where this all began. It's not where did you get these ideas of your superior? Because somebody in a little room said, I'm going to put this out there.
And it sounds good.
I don't, you know, you can look at you every day and look at the leaders and look at intelligence and know that there's no such thing.
Yeah. No, that's some dumbasses running around. I think they did the opposite. I think they kept the retarded and threw away the geniuses.
They were never smart. They were, if you think of the ideas that they come up with, if they were super intelligent beings, they know better. Either that or they wanted to pull the wool. They had another agenda. But they couldn't possibly have believed half of the things that they said and put out there and tried to teach and ingrain in people if they really were superior. They couldn't possibly have believed that shit.
If you're
right. And of course, we don't want anybody to feel superior, especially when it's almost time for me to explain the genetics you guys were talking about.
Oh shit. Here we go. Reverend Ed's getting down with the sickness now. Oh hell.
And I've been holding back. I am like a whole pack of bloodthirsty Wolverines and pit bulls trying to get to a steak right now.
That's
why I'm standing up right now.
And jump up and down and hallelujah.
Reverend Ed, I like the glasses, brother.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, it look good.
After all, you know, the Reverend Doctor does have to look good, you know, once in a while. I have to look like I know something.
You got a little edification.
I'll be calling in because I got a couple of questions for the Ed on certain Bible verses.
Your precious voice on my show will increase the ratings 1,000-fold. So stick around, kid.
All right.
All right.
I gotta
Are you ready, Rev?
To eat.
Oh, go get.
Go get yourself something to eat, sweetie.
Yeah, what you gonna eat? What you?
I don't know. Something that's gonna refuel her, and next thing she's gonna be a fireball flying straight at me. So I better be ready.
I'm making cannoli.
Oh, cannolis.
Cannoli. Hey, send some in the mail, will you please?
Send some to me. Yeah. All right, Rev. Are you ready?
Come on.
You know, it's kind of weird that I'm actually asking you, "Are you ready?" when I'm already,
You already know the answer to that question, son.
Then here we go.
All right.